So in this video, we will be continuing where we left off for Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco. And guess what, everyone? I just learned something from a friend of mine, Sarah. She works at Barnes & Noble, and we were hanging out, and she came over, and she's like, she saw this book sitting out. She's like, "Oh, did you get the new one? The third one just came out." I was like, "Third one? I didn't even know there was a second one." So yes, everyone, this is a series. So I have bought the next two in the series that are out right now. The next book is called Hunting Prince Dracula, and then the other one is Escaping from Houdini. So yeah, it's a series. I had no idea. Yeah, so we'll be reading more than I thought. I thought this would be a one book and then just, picking something else to go, but no, it's going to keep going. Very interesting. Alrighty, and it is the same character, so I did check. She is in the book, so it is definitely a series. It's definitely with Audrey Rose. So, yeah, that's something I learned. Anyway, last video, I believe we were able to open the gift on page 71, I want to say, yes. And the next gift is at the end of page 109, which is, we're on chapter 8. We'll be picking up on chapter 8 in this video and going on, but that's, I believe, at the end of chapter 10. So that's yeah, it is. So it's 3 chapters. I don't know if we're going to get to it today, but we'll see. Okay, we'll see how it is once we get to the end of chapter 9. Alright, so without further ado, this is Reading by Ree, be picking up on chapter 8 of Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco. Chapter 8. Bring Out Your Nearly Dead. Great Western Royal Hotel, Paddington Station, 11 September 1888. The tea room in the Great Western Royal Hotel was unbearably warm. Or perhaps it was simply the fiery rage burning inside me. Sitting with my hands folded politely in my lap, I prayed for the strength I'd need to stop myself from reaching across the table and wrapping my fingers around a neck instead of cucumber sandwiches and petite fours. "You look as if you've not slept, Miss Cresswell. You look as if you've not slept, Mr. Cresswell." "Who said I did, Miss Wadsworth?" I raised my brows. "Doing subversive things at indecent hours?" "Would it offend you if I were?" Thomas smiled at the waiter and leaned in, whispering in his ear. The waiter nodded, then marched off. Once we were alone, he turned his steady focus on me, calculating 1,000 things simultaneously. I lifted the porcelain cup to my lips, forcing a sip of tea down. I'd agreed to meet him here only to go over case details. Now he was doing that infuriating thing where he'd inevitably guess my secret plans, and I'd have to murder him, in front of all these witnesses, no less. What a pity. "Sir?" The waiter came back to the table, presenting Thomas with 3 things: a silver ashtray laid out with cigarettes, matches he produced from his black trousers, and an orchid. Thomas handed the flower to me, then plucked a smoke from the tray, allowing the waiter to light the end. A gray cloud puffed into the air between us. I purposefully coughed, batting the smoke back toward his side of the table. "I cannot believe you'd buy me a beautiful flower only to ruin it with smoking," I said, scowling. "How incredibly rude." Smoking in front of a girl without her permission was against social mores, but Thomas didn't seem to care for that rule one bit. I set the orchid down, staring at him through a fringe of slitted lashes. But he only took another drag, slowly letting the toxic air out before dismissing the waiter. He reminded me of the caterpillar from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, sitting upon his giant mushroom, lazing about without a care in the world. If only he were small enough to squish beneath my boots. That's a disgusting habit. So is dissecting the dead prior to breakfast, but I don't scorn you for that unseemly habit. In fact, He leaned closer, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. I butchered that, my bad. It's rather endearing seeing you up to your elbows in viscera each morning. Also, you're quite welcome for the flower. Do place it on your nightstand and think of me while dressing for bed. I dropped my finger sandwich onto my plate, shoving it away with as much vehemence as I could muster. Thomas pulled in another lungful of smoke, meeting my gaze with a flash of defiance and something else I couldn't quite read. Well then, I see there's nothing more to say. Good day, Mr. Cresswell. Before I stood, Thomas's hand shot out, gently circling my wrist. I gasped, drawing my hand back and glanced around. Thankfully, no one had seen his indiscretion. I swatted away his second attempt to hold me, though I didn't exactly mind his touch. I see your addiction has addled that brain of yours. On the contrary, dear Wadsworth, he said between puffs, I find nicotine gives me an added boost of clarity. You ought to try it. He flipped the awful thing around, offering it to me, but there were limits I'd set for myself as far as amateur sleuthing was concerned. Smoking was one of them. He shrugged, returning to his nicotine intake. Suit yourself, he said. Now then, I'm coming with you. I looked him squarely in the eye. Thomas was no longer showering me with cool indifference. He was warm as an August afternoon, his lips turned up at the corners. A flame flared across my body when I realized I was studying the shape of his mouth, the way his bottom lip was slightly fuller, and all too inviting for a girl without a chaperone to take notice of. I collected my thoughts like specimens to be dissected further. Clearly, I was experiencing some sort of degenerative medical condition if I was thinking such indecent thoughts about the scoundrel. He was likely goading me into a kiss. I'm going home. You most certainly are not invited. I dared to meet his gaze in spite of my momentary lapse in judgment. Nathaniel won't approve of finding a boy in our home, no matter how innocent our work situation may be. Going home, are you? Shaking his head, he tisked. Let's promise each other one thing. He leaned across the table, reaching for my hands, which I quickly stuck under the table. We always tell each other the truth, no matter how harsh it may be. That's what partners do, Wadsworth. They don't bother with preposterous lies. I beg your pardon? I whispered harshly, not particularly enjoying the casual use of my surname he kept tossing about, though I'd permitted it. I didn't lie. Thomas held a hand up, shaking his head. Fine. What makes you so sure I even need a partner? I'm quite capable of doing things on my own. Perhaps it's not you who would benefit from our partnership, he said quietly. His response was so unexpected, I covered my mouth with the back of my gloved hand. The very idea he might need someone, and chose me out of everyone in London, sent foolish notions dancing through my head before I banished them. I would not fancy Thomas Cresswell. I would not. Watching him stub his cigarette out, a deep sigh worked its way out of me. You ought to buy a ticket, then. We'll be leaving for... Pulling a folded ticket from his jacket, he flashed a mischievous grin. My jaw practically hit the table. How in the name of the Queen did you know where we'd be going? Thomas folded the ticket up, securing it back in its safe place, his look smugger than a mutt stealing a Christmas goose. That's quite a simple question, Wadsworth. You're wearing lace-up leather boots. Indeed, so simple. I rolled my eyes. If I don't murder you this afternoon, it'll be a gift sent directly from God himself, and I vow to attend services again, I said, holding a hand against my heart. I knew I'd get you to church eventually. He brushed the front of his suit down. I'm impressed with how swiftly you've relented, though I am hard to resist. He sat straighter like a peacock showing off its colorful plumage. I imagined him preening himself as if he had a fan of bright feathers growing from his backside. I motioned for him to get on with it. You were saying? On a normal day, you wear silk shoes. Leather is better suited for rain, he said, matter-of-factly. Since it's not raining in London yet, and according to the paper, reading has been pouring buckets all morning, it didn't take much to deduce you'd be headed there. I so badly wanted to say something cutting, but Thomas wasn't finished impressing me yet. When you first rushed through the lobby, your attention shifted to the clock mounted on the wall. You hadn't seen me standing near waiting for you. leading me to believe you were in a hurry." He took a sip of tea. "A quick check of the department's board, and I noted the next train leaving for Reading was at 12 noon. Quite easy, as it was also the only train leaving at that time." He sat back with a self-indulgent grin plastered across his face. "I paid the waiter to fetch me a ticket, ran to our table, then ordered our tea, all before you had your duster checked." I closed my eyes. He really was an enormous test of my patience, but he might prove useful with my next task. If anyone would be able to read a situation, it'd be Thomas Cresswell. I wanted answers regarding Miss Emma Elizabeth Smith and her association with my family, and could think of only one person who might know about her. I stood, and Thomas joined me, eager to move on to our next mission. "Hurry along, then," I said, grabbing my orchid and securing it safely in my journal. "I want to sit by the window." "What now?" I asked, losing patience. "I usually sit by the window. You may have to sit in my lap." Oh, he's such a sly fox, isn't he, guys? Anyway, continuing. Within 10 minutes, we were standing below gigantic wrought iron arches that spanned Paddington Station like iron bones, holding the glass flesh of the ceiling up in a show of man-made perfection. There was something thrilling about the cylindrical shape of the station as it teemed with people and huge steam-breathing machines. Our train was already waiting on the tracks, so we climbed aboard and situated ourselves for the ride. Soon we were off. I watched the gray, fog-filled world blur by as we chugged our way out of London and across the English countryside, my thoughts consumed with a million questions. The first being, was I wasting my time? What if Thornley knew nothing? Perhaps we should have stayed in London and pored over more of Uncle's notes, though it was too late for turning back now. Thomas, once he'd woken from a disturbed nap, fidgeted in his seat, enough to draw my attention to him. He was like a child who'd eaten too many sweets and couldn't sit still. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" I whispered, glancing at the passengers around us, who were tossing dirty looks Thomas's way. "Why can't you act properly for an hour?" He crossed, then uncrossed his long legs, then did the same with his arms. I was starting to think he hadn't heard me when he finally responded. "Are you going to enlighten me on where exactly we're going, or is the suspense part of the surprise?" "Can you not deduce it, Cresswell?" "I'm not a magician, Wadsworth," he said. I can deduce when facts are presented to me, not when they're purposely obscured." I narrowed my eyes. Even though there were 1,000 other things I should be concerned with, I couldn't stop myself from asking. "Are you feeling ill?" His attention shifted to me before moving back to the window. "Do you suffer from claustrophobia or arachnophobia?" "I find the act of traveling very dull." He sighed. Another moment of the inane conversation of the people behind us, or the blasted chugging of the engine, and I might lose my mind altogether. Thomas grew silent again, accentuating his point about the annoying conversation and overwhelming sound of the train. "Perhaps this is our murderer's motivation for killing," he mumbled. "Oh, perhaps this is our murderer's motivation for killing," he mumbled. I laid my head against the seat and eavesdropped. According to society, this was precisely what young women were supposed to be concerned with: shoes, silks, dinner parties, and who might be the handsomest duke or lord in the kingdom. How one might secure an invitation to an important ball or tea, who was in the Queen's favor and who wasn't. Who was old and smelly but worth marrying anyway. My daily worries were so far removed. I feared I'd always be shunned against my peers. While I enjoyed finery, I tried imagining myself chattering on about a napkin design, but my thoughts kept turning to deceased bodies, and I laughed at my failure to even picture being a so-called normal young lady. I was determined to be both pretty and fierce, as Mother had said I could be. Just because I was interested in a man's job didn't mean I had to give up being girly. Who defined those roles anyhow? "Truly, Thomas," I said, trying to contain a laugh. "People needn't debate rhetoric in order to be interesting. Is there nothing you fancy outside of the laboratory?" Thomas was unamused. "You aren't exactly the queen of intellectually stimulating conversation this afternoon." "Feeling neglected, are you?" "Perhaps I am." "We're going to see my father's former valet, you insufferable thing," I said. "I have reason to believe he might have information regarding one of our victims. Satisfied?" Thomas's legs stopped bouncing and he swiveled to face me. I sincerely disliked when he studied me so openly, as if I were a complex mathematical equation he had to solve. He absent-mindedly tapped his leg, leaving me to conclude his brain was working furiously. The train whistle blew a steam-filled warning that reading station was approaching at the same time a flourish of rain pelted our windows as if on cue. He smiled to himself. Looks like this afternoon just became a bit more intriguing. Horse hooves clacked on the wet stones of Broad Street as our rented carriage moved up the hill to Aldous Thornley's residence. My stomach flipped with each jolting sway, and I feared I'd lose my lunch on the rain-soaked cobblestones. I pulled the navy curtain back, focusing on our surroundings instead of my growing nausea. The town was filled with people selling wares despite the unpleasant weather. Awnings covered vendors from the elements. I watched as a woman haggled with a man over a basket of seeds she was selling. Thomas pointed to a large building on our right, purposely leaning over my shoulder, his breath tickling the high lace collar covering my neck. Reading. Famous for its 3 B's of business, breweries, bulbs, and biscuits. That's the Huntley and Palmer's factory. Their biscuits are my favorite for tea, I said. Though I didn't absorb much of what Thomas was saying regarding the history of their company, I twisted my hands until I popped a button off my gloves, then stopped. If he noticed, which he most likely did, Thomas didn't comment on my display of nervousness. I was grateful he didn't ask me to explain anything further about our trip, and even more grateful for his attempt to distract me by pointing out every factory we passed. Another giant building puffed smoke into the rainy sky, like a man exhaling a cigar into the atmosphere. This morning I'd been sure coming here was the best course of action. Now, little buds of doubt were blossoming in my mind. Each drop of water hitting the top of our carriage echoed loudly in my ears, setting my nerves on edge. Maybe Miss Emma Elizabeth did work for our household prior to her fall into destitution, I said. Maybe that's where her connection to my father ends. Perhaps, Thomas said, studying me. It's best knowing for sure, though. I chewed my bottom lip, hating myself for worrying so much. Was I mostly worried about being wrong or being horrendously wrong in front of Thomas? The latter half of that question bothered me. Since when had his opinion of my intelligence become so important? I could barely stand him. What he thought of me should mean absolutely nothing. But it did matter, more than I cared to admit. Then there was the even darker question I didn't want to acknowledge at all. What connected my father to those 2 murdered women? I couldn't help fearing the odds were stacked against this being some bizarre coincidence. But how everything fit together remained a mystery. Well, if anyone in our household knows intimate details of my father's life before Mother's death, it's Mr. Thornley, I said. He's dressed my father for every occasion and knew when and where he was at all times. He probably knew my father as well, if not better than my mother had. If he hadn't gotten too old to perform his duties, I'm sure he'd still be right by Father's side. Everything will be fine, Wadsworth. We'll either have answers or we won't, but at least we've gone out and tried. A flash of lightning lit the dark sky, as if the Titans were clashing in the heavens. Thunder followed, reminding me of my parents. When I was younger and terrified of the storms that blew through London, I'd curl into Mother's lap, while Father told me thunder was the sound angels made when they played skittles. Mother'd call down to the cook, fetch us some curry and flatbread reminiscent of grandmother's homeland, of grandmama's homeland, then fill my head with stories of heroines from faraway places. From then on, I almost enjoyed thunderstorms. Soon the carriage ride was blessedly over. We huddled beneath an umbrella in the doorway of a small stone house sandwiched next to 20 other identical homes that looked like cowsheds. Thomas knocked, then stood back, allowing me to greet Father's former servant first. Wish I'd get rid of this cough for good. The door creaked open, its hinges in desperate need of a good oiling, and the unpleasant scent of boiled vegetables lazily wafted out. I expected to see familiar wrinkles around kind eyes and snow-white hair. I did not expect a young woman with a child hoisted on her hip, looking less than pleased by an unannounced afternoon interruption. Her ginger hair was pulled into a braid coiling around the nape of her neck. Her clothing was well worn, with patches on her elbows. Stray hairs fell from around her face, and she blew them back, with little luck of keeping them out of her eyes. Thomas quietly cleared his throat, spurring me to action. Pardon me. I was looking for someone, I stammered, glancing at the number 23 on the door. It appears I've got the wrong address. There was something intimidating about the way she was standing there staring, but we'd come all this way, and I wasn't about to let someone with a sour attitude get the better of me. Her gaze traveled slowly over Thomas. Twice. She reminded me of someone who was being tempted by a succulent-looking steak, and I didn't care for it one bit. I cleared my throat as another flash of lightning rushed across the sky. You wouldn't happen to know where I could find Mr. Thornley, would you? The baby picked that moment to start wailing, and the young woman shot me a glare, as if I'd spurred the devil out of him instead of the booming thunder. Cooing to the screeching demon on her hip, she patted its back gently. He's dead. Had Thomas not grabbed my arm to steady me, I might have fallen backward. But when? Well, he isn't fully dead yet, she admitted. But he isn't much longer for this world. If he makes it through the night, it'll be a miracle. She shook her head. Poor thing doesn't hardly look himself any more. Best you keep the memory of him untainted, else you'll have nightmares for years to come. The warm, sympathetic part of me wanted to say sweet words for our former servant's imminent passing, but this was our only chance to gain insight about my father's whereabouts during the murders and his potential connection to Miss Emma Elizabeth Smith. I stood taller, imagining the veins flowing through my body were nothing more than steel wires, cold and unfeeling. Now was the time to find that scientific switch Thomas relied on. I really must see him. If it's of the highest importance. You wouldn't deny me saying goodbye to a dear friend, especially not one who's in the throes of death, would you? The young woman stared open-mouthed before snapping her jaw shut. She bumped the door open with her unoccupied hip, gesturing us inside with an impatient wave of her hand. Pointing to a holder in the corner, she jerked her chin. Put your brolly there and suit yourself then, she said. He's upstairs, first door on the right. Thank you. I crossed the tiny foyer, with Thomas on my heels, heading up the worn staircase as quickly as I could. The scent of boiled cabbage followed us as we ascended, adding to the ill-filling churning in my stomach. When my foot reached the top step, the woman called out in a mocking tone. Nightmares will be your bedmates tonight. All the fancy sheets in the world won't make a lick of difference. Don't say I didn't warn you, my lady. This time, when I heard a crash of thunder, I shuddered. Oh. That was the end of Chapter 8. And we're about to start Chapter 9, but we've got a pretty gruesome image here of tubercular leprosy, 19th century. Let's see if you guys can get a good look at it. But it closes again. So I guess that might be what her dear friend has. We're about to find out. Chapter 9. Message from the Grave. Thornley Residence. Reading. 11 September, 1888. Gauzy curtains, that had possibly been white once, billowed towards us, as if they were two decaying arms desperately reaching for release. If I were forced to stay in this tomb-like room for long, I'm sure I'd become as desperate. Drops of rain splattered onto the sill, but I didn't dare close the window. A small wrought-iron bed with a striped mattress displayed a skeletal body that barely looked alive. Poor Thornley had withered away to nothing more than graying skin pulled taut over fragile bones. Open sores on his torso and arms oozed a mixture of blood and pus reeking of fetid meat, even from the doorway. It was hard to say for sure, but he looked to be suffering from a form of leprosy. I covered my nose with the back of my hand, catching Thomas doing the same from the corner of my eye. The smell was overwhelming at best, and the sight before us was by far the worst thing I'd ever seen. Which was saying a lot, as I'd witnessed the putrid insides of the departed on countless occasions during Uncle's post-mortems. I closed my eyes, but the rotten image was burned onto the backs of my lids. I would have thought him long deceased, but the slight rise and fall of his chest defined what my eyes told me to be true. If I were a superstitious person, I'd believe he was one of the undead haunting the English moors searching for souls to steal, or possibly eat. All my life I'd been interested in biological anomalies, like the elephant man, giganticism, conjoined twins, and ectrodactyly. I don't know that word. But this seemed a cruel act of God. The young woman was right. This was the place of nightmares came to be inspired. This was the place nightmares came to be inspired. The curtains inhaled wet breaths, then slowly exhaled, their dampness sticking to the wood before rustling free with the next gust of storm-drenched wind. I took a breath through my mouth. We needed to either run back downstairs, and preferably all the way to the train station while screaming bloody murder, or speak with the poor man immediately. The former had been my vote, even if it meant running in the rain, in heeled boots and possibly breaking my neck. But the latter was inevitably what we were going to do. Thomas nodded encouragement, then walked fully into the room, leaving me propped against the door frame with nothing but my wits supporting me. If he was capable of facing this, then so was I. If only my body would catch up with my brain's courage. He pulled 2 chairs close to the bed, their limbs scraping in protest, before motioning for me to have a seat. My legs carried me across the room, seemingly of their own volition, spurring my heart into a steady gallop. I buried my hands in the folds of my skirts once I sat down. I didn't want poor Thornley seeing how badly they were shaking. He was going through enough as it was. A vicious cough raked his body, forcing veins on his neck to stand out like tree roots being yanked from the earth. I poured a glass of water from a pitcher next to the bed, carefully bringing it to his lips. "Drink this, Mr. Thornley," I said gently. "It'll soothe your throat." The old man slowly sipped from the glass. Water sloshed all over his chin, and I dabbed it with a handkerchief to avoid giving him chills on top of his other ailments. When he'd had enough, his milky eyes turned to mine. I had no idea if he was blind, but smiled at him nonetheless. Recognition filtered into his features after a moment or two. "Miss Wadsworth." He coughed again, this time less violently than before. "You're as lovely as your mother. She would have been pleased with how fine you turned out. Lord rest her soul." Even though I'd heard it all my life, it still brought the sting of tears to my eyes. Reaching out, I smoothed his thinning hair off his forehead, mindful of avoiding the open sores. I didn't think he was contagious, but took no chances and kept my gloves on. He closed his eyes, his chest stilling. At first I was terrified he'd crossed into the afterlife. Then his eyes fluttered open. I exhaled. We needed answers straight away. I hated myself for jumping right into things, but feared he'd quickly lose energy and be unable to speak much longer. I said a silent prayer that my ticket home was still heading directly for London and not detouring into hell. Thomas watched the valet with complete detachment, ignoring everything else altogether. It chilled me, seeing how unaffected he was by our current situation, how capable he was of flicking his emotions off on command. No matter how useful it was still unnatural and reminded me of how little I knew but him beyond Uncle's laboratory. As if sensing my distress, Thomas drew out of his deductions long enough to meet my worried gaze and nod. It jolted me from my thoughts. I leaned closer to the bed, tying my nerves into knots. "I know you're unwell, Mr. Thornley, but I was hoping to ask you a bit about my father." I took a deep breath. "I'd also like to know who Miss Emma Elizabeth Smith was." He stared, his eyes, and whatever memories played behind them, shuddering before me. His attention shifted to Thomas. "Are you betrothed to my dear girl?" Thomas actually turned scarlet, his well-armored demeanor shaken. He stuttered through a response, looking in every direction but mine. She's colleagues," I supplied, unable to stop myself from enjoying how flustered he'd gotten. In spite of the purpose of our visit and how odd his behavior could be, I was quite pleased something rattled him, all the more because it was over me. He rolled his eyes when I grinned at him. We're both apprenticing under Uncle, that is." Thornley closed his eyes, but not before I caught a flash of disapproval. Even straddling death's doorway, he was appalled by my association with Uncle and his unholy research. Apparently the fact that I wasn't spending more time securing a husband was another strike against me. I'd have felt shame if I hadn't had a greater purpose for being here. Let people think what they want. Or let people think what they like, I thought crossly, then immediately cringed. The man was dying. I needn't worry about his opinion or scorn him for it. I sat straighter, my tone kind but strong. I need you to tell me how Father knew Miss Emma Elizabeth Smith. My father's former valet stared over my shoulder and through the window, the rain streaking down like tears. It was hard to tell if he was ignoring my inquiry or losing consciousness. I glanced at Thomas, whose torn expression mirrored my own. Pushing a dying man was a horrible thing to do, and if Thomas Cresswell was second-guessing our being here, then I'd really strayed from doing the proper thing. Perhaps I was the deplorable creature society thought me to be. I could only imagine what Aunt Amelia would have to say or how many times she'd cross herself, telling me to pray for my sins, religious fiend that she was. Deciding I'd put him through enough, I stood. I must apologize, Mr. Thornley. I see I've upset you, and that wasn't my intention. Releasing my skirts, I clasped his cold hands in mine. You've been a great friend to our family. I cannot thank you enough for serving us all so well. Might as well tell them, grandfather. The young woman who'd answered the door now stood with her arms crossed at the foot of the bed, her voice gentler than I'd have thought possible. Clear your conscience before taking that last journey, she said. What harm can come of telling her what she wants to know? Now I saw the strong family resemblance. They both had the same thick brows that held two enchantingly large eyes and perfectly high cheekbones. The red tint to her hair hinted at their Irish roots, and the handful of freckles tossed across her nose made her more girlish than I'd originally thought. Without the child marring her demeanor, I'd say she wasn't much older than I was. Part of what she'd said replayed in my mind. Do you know anything about it? I asked. She stared blankly, as if I'd spoken another language, about why he'd need to clear his conscience. She shook her head, shifting her focus to her grandfather's restless form. He hasn't said anything specific as such, just frets about it at night is all. Sometimes, when he's sleeping, he'll mumble a bit. I've never been able to make sense of it. Thornley scratched his arm so roughly, I was afraid he'd tear himself open. That explained some of the sores. He was giving himself scabs and picking them until they were infected. It wasn't leprosy then. It simply looked like it. I swallowed nausea down in one unpleasant gulp. His pain must be unimaginable. Grabbing a tin of lotion from the bedside table, his granddaughter hurried to his side and lathered it on his arms. His organs are shutting down, causing him to itch something terrible. At least that's what the doctor said. She applied another generous amount of the cream, and he quieted down. Lotion helps, but doesn't last long. Try not scratching it so hard, grandfather. You're ripping your skin to shreds. Thomas shifted in his chair, the telltale sign he was growing antsy to share his opinion. I gave him a withering look that I hoped conveyed the amount of pain he'd be in should he act like his usual charming self around the Thornleys. He ignored me and my glare. What I recall of my studies, it's all part of the death process, he said, ticking each symptom off on his fingers. You stop eating, sleep more, breathing becomes labored, then the body itches begin, and that's quite enough, I interrupted, shooting Thornley and his granddaughter sympathetic looks. They knew the end was imminent. They needn't hear explicit details of what came next. I only thought to help, he whispered. Clearly my services are unwelcome. Thomas lifted a shoulder, then returned to quietly assessing the room. We would need to work on his helping skills in the future. I turned back to my father's valet. Really, anything you can tell me about that time period would be immensely helpful. There's no one else whom I can turn to for answers. Some recent events have occurred, and it eased my mind. Thornley's eyes welled up. He motioned for his granddaughter to come closer. Jane, my love, would you mind getting us some tea? Jane narrowed her eyes. Wouldn't be trying to get rid of me now, would you? You haven't asked for tea in days. Her tone was more playful than accusatory, garnering a small smile from her grandfather. Very well. I'll go fetch some tea then. Behave yourself until I get back. Mum will hang me if she thinks I've mistreated you. Once Jane was out of the room, Thornley took a few labored breaths, then looked at me, his focus clearer than it was a few seconds earlier. Miss Emma Elizabeth Smith was a dear friend of your mother's, Miss Audrey Rose. You probably don't recall her, though. Stopped coming around when you were still a little thing." He coughed, but shook off my offer of some more water. "She also knew your uncle and father. The four of them were thick as thieves in their younger years. In fact, your uncle was betrothed to her at one time." Confusion wrapped its fingers around my brain. The way Uncle's notes were written made it seem as if he didn't know the first thing about her. I'd never have guessed she was an acquaintance, let alone someone he'd been close to marrying. Thomas raised his brows. Apparently that was something not even he saw coming. I faced Thornley again. "Do you have any idea why Father would have kept track of her?" Thunder crashed above us, booming a warning of its own. Thornley swallowed, his attention darting around the room as if he were afraid of something horrid reaching for him from beyond the grave. His chest swelled before he lost himself in another bout of coughing. If he kept this up, I was certain he'd lose the ability to communicate altogether. His voice was like gravel crunching beneath horse hooves when he managed to speak again. "Your father's a very powerful and wealthy man, Miss Audrey Rose. I don't presume to know anything about his personal inquiries. I only know two things regarding Miss Smith. She was betrothed to your uncle, and—" His eyes grew so wide they were mostly white. Struggling to sit back in bed, he kicked and coughed himself into a frenzy. Jumping up, Thomas tried holding the old man down to prevent him from injuring himself with his convulsions. Thornley shook his head violently, blood collecting at the corners of his mouth. "I just remembered. He knows. He knows the dark secrets hidden within the walls. Within the wall." "Who knows?" I begged, desperately trying to figure out if this was part of an elaborate delusion or if his rant held any merit for our investigation. "What wall?" Thornley closed his eyes, a guttural whine seeping out of his mouth. "He knows what happened. He was there that night. It's all right." "It's all right," Thomas said in a warm tone I'd never heard him use with anyone else before. "It's all right, sir. Take a breath for me. That's it. Good." I watched as Thomas held the old man steady, his touch forceful yet gentle. "Better? Now try and tell us again. This time, slower." Yes, he wheezed. "Can't blame him, though." Thornley gasped, struggling to get more words out while I rubbed his back, trying miserably to soothe him. No, can't blame him," he said, coughing again. "Not sure I'd be much better, given the circumstances." "Blame who?" "Blame whom?" I asked, not knowing how to calm him down enough to gather coherent information. "Whom are you speaking of, Mr. Thornley? My father? Uncle Jonathan?" He wheezed so hard his eyes rolled into the back of his head. I was terrified it was all over, that I'd just witnessed a man die, but he thrashed about, sitting up fully, grasping the sheets on either side of the emaciated body. "Alistair knows." I was more confused than ever. Alistair was a name I was unfamiliar with, and I wasn't even sure Thornley knew what he was saying any longer. I gently patted his hand while Thomas looked on in horror. Shh, now it's okay, Mr. Thornley. You've been immensely. It's because of that cursed." A shudder went through his body so turbulently, it was as if he'd been flying a metal kite during the lightning storm going on outside. He convulsed until a steady stream of blood trickled down the side of his mouth and escaped from his nostrils. I jumped back, shouting for his granddaughter to come back and help us, but it was too late. Mr. Thornley was dead. Whew, that sounded like a terrible way to go. It's because of that cursed. Dang it! We didn't get enough information, guys. Not enough, if you ask me. But we have a new lead. A Mr. What'd they say? Alistair. And the plot thickens. So, Chapter 10. Let's see. I don't have my timer going, so I actually don't know how long this is. But I think we're gonna stop there and pick back up in the next video on Chapter 10, which we will, at the end of Chapter 10, it ends on page 110, and on page 109 we have a new gift to open, which is right here in this little bag, and it says open at end of page 109. So that will definitely be happening in the next reading. Okay, I hope you guys are really enjoying the book. I know I am, and I'm actually excited to know that this is going to keep going, and we'll figure it out. I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of hoping something steamy happens between Miss Audrey Rose and Mr. Thomas Cresswell. But I don't know, probably not, but I'm hoping. Anyway, that's it for now. Reading by Ree. Until next time, bye!